Dante Veyron slammed his palm flat on the dining room table, so hard the crystal glasses rattled and the candles flickered. And then he looked at his wife of 11 years, sitting across from him, and said the words he'd been rehearsing for 3 weeks. I want a divorce. And I want it done before the end of the month. Serafina Vale didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't reach for her wine glass, or look away, or do any of the things a woman was supposed to do when her husband detonated her marriage in front of 12 family elders and their wives. She just looked at him. Still, quiet, the way deep water looks still when something enormous is moving underneath it. Then Dante did the second thing, the worst thing, the thing that nobody in that room would ever be able to forget. He reached back without looking and took Celeste Arden's hand, pulling the woman forward from the doorway, where she'd been waiting, her red dress deliberately chosen, her smile already assembled. "This is who I'm going to marry," Dante said. "This is who deserves to stand beside me." Serafina looked at Celeste for exactly 3 seconds. Then she reached up, removed her wedding ring, and set it on the table in front of her plate with the soft, deliberate sound of a door closing. "All right," she said, "that was it. That was all," she said. And every person in that room, every hardened captain, every elder who'd watched men beg and bleed and break, felt something cold move through them, because they knew what Dante Veyron did not know. They had always known, and now the clock had started. If you've ever watched someone you trusted light a match and smile while your life burned down around them, then you already understand what this story is about. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay close, because nothing in the next 2 hours is going to be what you expect. The Veyron name had meant something in Chicago for 40 years. Not the clean kind of something, not hospitals with donor plaques or universities with named buildings. The Veyron name meant that when you had a problem the police couldn't solve or wouldn't touch, there was a number you could call. It meant the docks ran on schedule. It meant the city's underground moved like a river with banks, contained and directed, instead of flooding into chaos. Dante's father, Marco Veyron, had built that reputation with his hands and his teeth, and he'd handed it to his son 16 years ago, on the night he died, of a heart attack in the back of a black car on the way to a meeting he never made. Dante had been 28 years old, raw and furious and convinced his father had left him something unfinished, something he needed to complete by being louder and harder than Marco had ever been. He wasn't wrong that Marco left things unfinished. He was spectacularly wrong about what those things were. Serafina had come into Dante's life 2 years after Marco's death, at a function she shouldn't have been able to attend, in a dress that cost more than most of the men in the room made in a month. She was 24. She had dark eyes that moved through a crowd like she was reading a map she'd memorized years ago. Dante had asked about her 3 separate times before anyone gave him a straight answer, and even then the answer was incomplete. She was the daughter of a family that no longer existed in any formal sense, a bloodline that had dissolved quietly into the city's history a decade earlier. He married her 14 months later because she was brilliant and composed, and because she had a way of making every room feel more stable just by being in it. He thought he was choosing her. It never occurred to him that she had been the one doing the choosing. For the first 3 years of their marriage, Serafina said very little at business functions. She sat beside Dante. She listened. She remembered names that Dante forgot and reminded him of them in the car on the way home, quietly, without making him feel stupid about the lapse. She learned the rhythms of every captain, every underboss, every elder who needed flattery and who needed respect, who had debts and who had leverage, who was afraid of their own ambitions, and who had buried those ambitions under 15 years of obedience. Building a map. Dante thought she was being a good wife. Rocco Marcelli had been Dante's underboss for 6 years. He was a compact man in his late 40s with close-cropped gray hair and a habit of pressing his thumbnail against his bottom lip when he was thinking through a problem. He was effective and economical, and he had never once in 6 years given Dante a reason to doubt him. He was also, as it turned out, the first person Serafina had recruited. It hadn't been complicated. 3 years into the Veyron marriage, Rocco had found himself in a position that could have ended his career his freedom, and possibly his life a financial exposure that traced back to a decision he'd made in 2019, a decision that Dante would have viewed as unforgivable disloyalty. Serafina had found out about it first. She had come to Rocco alone, without messengers, without witnesses. She had laid the evidence on his kitchen table, and then she had sat down across from him and said, "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to offer you a different kind of loyalty, one that goes in both directions." Rocco had asked her what she wanted. "Nothing right now," she'd said. "I just want you to know that I know, and that I'm not your enemy." He'd thought about it for 2 weeks. Then he'd called the number she'd left and said 3 words, "Tell me more." Started. Not with fear, not with coercion. With the quiet accumulation of mutual understanding between 2 people who both recognized that Dante Veyron, for all his ferocity, was building his empire on foundations he didn't fully understand. By the time Dante announced the divorce at the dinner table, Serafina had spent 8 years having those kinds of conversations with captains. With the family's accountant, a meticulous man named Gerald Oates, who had once watched Marco Veyron sign documents that Gerald knew were binding in ways Marco hadn't understood. With Judge Harriet Calloway, who had been managing the family's legal exposure for a decade, and who had said to Serafina over coffee 18 months ago, "Your husband thinks I work for him." I've never corrected that impression. With Vincent Mara, the union head who controlled 3 of the city's most critical port operations, and who had once told Dante to his face, "You're Marco's son," and that means something, while privately thinking that what it meant was considerably less than Dante believed. She hadn't told any of them what to do. She had simply made sure that all of them understood who she was, what she knew, and why her continued stability was in their interest. She had been patient in a way that Dante was constitutionally incapable of being patient. Because patience requires believing that time is on your side, and Serafina had always believed that. The morning after the dinner, Dante sat in his office on the 3rd floor of the estate and thought he had won something. He hadn't slept well. There was a tight feeling in his chest that he refused to name, but he told himself it was satisfaction. He had done the thing he'd been building toward for 8 months. He had chosen Celeste, chosen advancement, chosen to stop pretending that his marriage was anything more than an arrangement that had outlived its usefulness. Celeste was connected to a network of West Coast investors who could expand the Veyron operation into markets that Chicago's geography had always made difficult. She was visible in the right rooms. She was ambitious in the right direction. Picked up his phone and called Rocco. The call went to voicemail. He set the phone down and told himself Rocco was probably in a meeting. He made himself coffee. He looked out the window at the estate grounds, the long driveway, the iron gate at the far end that his grandfather had installed in 1974 because, as his grandfather once said, a man who can't control, who comes through his front door, can't control anything. His phone buzzed. Not a call, an automated notification from the financial management system his accountant used. An anomaly alert. Account access irregularity. Dante frowned at it and called Gerald Oates. Gerald answered on the first ring, which was unusual. Gerald was a man who let calls sit for exactly 1 ring before answering, a habit so consistent it had become a kind of signature. Answering immediately meant something was already wrong. "Tell me," Dante said. 3 of the primary operating accounts show access holds, Gerald said. His voice was the voice of a man choosing his words with surgical precision. Not freezes, technically. Access holds. There's a compliance flag on each of them that I didn't place. Who placed them? A pause. The flags are internally originated, Mr. Veyron. They came from within our own authorization structure. That's not an answer, Gerald. No, Gerald said quietly. It isn't. Dante ended the call and sat very still for about 45 seconds. Then he called Rocco again. Voicemail again. He called 2 of his captains, Marcus Webb, and a man everyone called Sully, who ran the North Side operations. Marcus answered and said he was handling something and would call back. Sully didn't answer at all. The tight feeling in Dante's chest got tighter. He went downstairs. The estate had 17 rooms on the main floor and a staff of 6 who lived on the property. Kitchen was empty. The main hall was empty. He walked through to the east sitting room and found Serafina there, reading. She was in one of the chairs near the window, with a cup of tea at her elbow and a book open in her hands. And she looked up when he came in with an expression of such complete neutrality that it was almost aggressive. "Where is everyone?" Dante said. "Wednesday morning," Serafina said. "Half the staff has the morning off. You approved the schedule in January. I'm not talking about the staff." He stayed in the doorway. "Something's happening with the accounts." She turned a page. "Did you hear what I said?" "I heard you." She looked up again. "What do you want me to say, Dante?" "You told me last night that we're divorcing. Our financial arrangements are going to be complicated. That's not a surprise. This isn't divorce proceedings. This is something else." He watched her face for any flicker of something: guilt, satisfaction, anxiety. Couldn't find one. "Someone inside the organization put holds on our operating accounts. You should call your accountant." I called Gerald. "He doesn't know who authorized it." Serafina closed her book. She held his gaze and said nothing for a moment. And in that moment, Dante had the sudden, vertiginous sensation of standing at the edge of something he couldn't see the bottom of. Then she said, "I'm sure you'll figure it out," and opened her book again. He left the room. In the hallway outside, he stood against the wall and made himself breathe slowly. Dante Veyron. He had held this through a federal investigation in 2018, through the Caruso War in 2020, through the collapse of the East Side Network, when 3 lieutenants were arrested in a single week. He had walked through fire and come out the other side, and he was not going to be destabilized by frozen accounts and missed calls and the unreadable expression of a woman he was divorcing. He called Rocco a third time. This time it rang once, and then went to voicemail, which meant Rocco had manually declined the call. Dante looked at his phone for a long time. Then he drove himself, no driver, no security, just himself in the car, to Rocco's office on the south side, a nondescript suite above a dry cleaning business that Rocco had used for 15 years because it had 3 exits and a view of the street in both directions. The office was locked. Through the glass panel in the door, he could see the desk was cleared. Not the casual cleared of someone's stepping out for the morning stripped. No files, no personal items, no family photographs that Rocco kept lined up along the back wall. Plants were gone. Dante pressed his palm flat against the glass and stared at the empty space where Rocco Marcelli had run the daily operations of the Veyron family for 6 years. He drove back to the estate. When he walked into the main hall, his phone was already ringing. It was Marcus Webb. Dante said. "I'm at the warehouse on Keller," Marcus said. His voice had something in it, not fear exactly, but the cousin of fear, discomfort. The voice of a man about to deliver information he would prefer not to deliver. "You need to know something. I just got here. The inventory is gone." "What do you mean gone?" "I mean the building is empty, Dante. Everything that was here yesterday isn't here today." A pause. "The loading dock shows 4 trucks came through last night, between 11 and 2. All 4 had valid authorization codes. I didn't authorize any trucks." The silence on the other end was its own kind of answer. "Marcus," Dante said. "Who signed the authorizations?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was careful and quiet. "The signature on the digital log is Serafina Veyron." Dante's hand tightened on the phone until his knuckles went pale. He hung up without another word and walked through the main hall and up the stairs and down the long corridor to the east wing of the 2nd floor, where his grandfather's private study had been preserved since the old man's death in 2009. Nobody used the room. It still smelled faintly of pipe smoke and old paper. Dante unlocked it with a key he kept on his personal ring and stood inside for a moment in the dusty afternoon light. Grandfather Enzo Veyron had been a meticulous man. He kept records of everything: contracts, agreements, bloodline records, the genealogical documentation that the old families had used to establish authority and legitimacy in the years when the organization had operated more like a formal hierarchy than a criminal enterprise. Dante had looked through these records once. Years ago, found them boring and incomprehensible, and locked the room back up. He pulled open the bottom drawer of the old desk and found the document boxes where he remembered them. He started reading. It took him 90 minutes to find what he needed, and when he found it, he sat back in his grandfather's chair and stared at the ceiling for a very long time. The Vale family. He'd known the name abstractly, the way you know the names of things that happened before you were paying attention. The Vales had been one of the founding bloodlines, one of 3 families that had built the original organization in Chicago in the 1950s. They had been, according to his grandfather's careful notations, the organizational architects, not the muscle, the structure, the relationships, the agreements that held everything else together. The Vales had dissolved as a family unit in the mid-1990s. Their last surviving heir had been a daughter born in 1984, Serafina Vale Veyron, born 1984. Dante read the notation in his grandfather's handwriting 3 times. Then he read the annotation beside it, added in a different ink, a different date, his grandfather's hand more cramped and slower written. Dante estimated, in the last years of Enzo's life. The annotation said, "She knows. She has always known." If you're reading this, Dante, it means you've finally started asking the right questions. The question you should be asking now is whether you've asked them too late. Dante set the document down on the desk. He sat in the old chair, in the old room that smelled of pipe smoke and old paper, and he thought about 11 years. He thought about every conversation he'd dismissed. Every moment he'd interpreted as deference that might have been calculation. Every room where she'd sat quietly while he talked, and he had felt, somewhere below awareness, that the room was more stable because of her presence, not because she was his wife, but because she was herself, and everyone in that room had understood something about her that he had not. He thought about the dinner table the night before, 12 elders and their wives, the silence that had followed his announcement. He had read that silence as acquiescence, as the natural order reasserting itself, as men and women who understood where power lived falling into line. He had been wrong about the silence. He stood up, left the study, and walked back down the corridor. His phone showed 14 missed calls, Captain's associates, the family lawyer. He called none of them back. He walked downstairs and found Serafina where he'd left her, still in the east sitting room. The tea replaced by a glass of water, the book different. She looked up when he came in. "You read them," she said. "Not a question." "The Vale records," he said. "Grandfather's annotations. He wrote that for you," she said. "He knew you'd eventually find them. He was hoping it would be sooner." She set the book down. "He came to me 3 months before he died. He was worried about what you'd become without someone to balance you. He was worried you were too much like your father, all force, no architecture." She looked at him steadily. "He asked me if I'd be willing to stay, even if it got hard." Dante's voice came out rougher than he intended. "And you said yes." "I said I'd consider it." She picked up her water glass. "And then I watched you for 2 years and decided you had enough of the right things in you that it was worth the patience." She paused. "I was right about that for a long time. Then you stopped surprising me." Dante stood in the doorway of his own sitting room and felt, for the first time in his adult life, that he was standing in a space that was not actually his, that had never been his, that he had occupied with such certainty and such noise that he'd mistaken volume for ownership. "Counts," he said, "the warehouse. Rocco." "Yes," she said simply. "You did all of it. Last night. While I was upstairs with Celeste. I've been doing all of it for years, Dante. Last night was just the part you were going to notice." He pushed himself off the doorframe and walked into the room. He didn't sit down. He stood in the middle of it and looked at her. And for the first time since he'd known her, he looked at her not as his wife, not as a piece of his life that he'd arranged, and then stopped examining, but as the person who was actually there. "What do you want?" he said. "I wanted you to choose correctly," she said. "At the dinner, when you had the chance." "Choose what?" "Me," she said. Her voice was even uninflected, which made it worse. "Not because of the Vale bloodline, or the accounts, or Rocco, or any of it. Because you looked at me across 11 years and understood that what we had was worth protecting." She set the glass down. "You didn't. You chose the expedient thing, the flashy thing, the thing that felt like advancement and was actually just appetite." Celeste Arden, Serafina said, cutting him off for the first time, "is not what you think she is. She let that sit for exactly a beat. Came to you through the DeLuca network. She's been feeding information from inside your operation for the last 4 months." 4 months? Dante went very still. She's working for the Batiste Syndicate out of New Orleans, Serafina continued. They've been trying to find a leverage point into the Veyron accounts for 2 years. You handed them one. She looked at him without expression. She didn't choose you because she wanted you, Dante. She chose you because you were the fastest way in. Dante's jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes, humiliation, fury, the specific pain of a man who has destroyed his marriage for something that was itself a lie. How long have you known, he said. 8 weeks, she said. I was waiting to see if you'd figure it out yourself. He turned away from her. He walked to the window and stood looking out to the gate, the long drive the iron that his grandfather had installed. As a man who can't control, who comes through his front door, can't control anything. Behind him, Serafina said, Dante. He didn't turn around. There's something else you should know, she said. The Batiste Syndicate isn't waiting anymore. Celeste has been telling them, the organization is in transition, that you've destabilized the internal structure, planning to move on the estate. He turned then. When? He said. Serafina looked at him with the kind of patience that only comes from having known something for a very long time and waiting for the right moment to say it. Tonight, she said. The silence in the room was absolute. Outside, the afternoon was going gray, the light thinning, the shadows starting to lengthen across the estate grounds. Dante looked at his wife, at the woman he had tried to dismiss, tried to replace, tried to make small enough to walk away from, and understood with a cold, clarifying certainty that he had made every wrong move available to him, in exactly the right order to leave himself with nothing. Except her. She was still here. What do we do? He said. Serafina stood up. She smoothed the front of her jacket, picked up her phone from the side table, and looked at it briefly, then looked back at him. We get ready, she said. There was something in the way. She said it, not we as in the two of them, scrambling to survive the night, but we as in she had already been getting ready for a long time, and she was simply now allowing him to stand inside what she'd built. Dante Veyron, who had believed his whole life that he was the most dangerous person in any room he entered, followed his wife out of the sitting room and into what was coming. He didn't lead. He followed, and the estate around them was quiet in the way that things are quiet before they aren't anymore. The estate had 7 exterior cameras, 4 panic rooms, and a network of underground passages that Dante had never used and barely knew existed. He learned this in the 40 minutes that followed Serafina's announcement, standing in the basement level of the main building, while she walked him through a schematic he had never seen, drawn by hand on architectural paper that had been stored, folded in a fireproof case behind the wine racks. My grandfather designed these, Dante said, looking at the paper. Your grandfather showed me these, Serafina said. In 2016, the year before he died. She pointed to the eastern corridor on the schematic. This connects to the gatehouse. This one runs under the garden to the secondary garage. This one, her finger moved to a line that ran beneath the main hall, comes up inside the east sitting room. Behind the bookcase. Dante stared at the passage marked behind the bookcase. He thought about every time he'd sat in that room. Every conversation. Every time Serafina had been there when he arrived without him hearing her come in. He didn't say anything about that. How many people know about this? He said. Rocco. Gerald. 2 of the captains. She folded the schematic back along its original creases. Not Marcus Webb. Why not Marcus? Serafina looked at him with a patience that had edges in it now, because Marcus Webb has been having dinner with Vincent Batiste's logistics coordinator every second Thursday for the past 3 months. The name hit Dante like cold water. Marcus Webb. 6 years. The man had answered his call this morning, had called him back about the warehouse, had delivered the information about Serafina's signature on the loading dock authorization. He'd been so careful about it, practical, almost sympathetic. Dante pressed the heel of his hand against his sternum. He called me this morning, he said, about the warehouse. I know, Serafina said. I heard. You heard. The landline in the kitchen has an extension. Old wiring. Most people forget it's there. She said it, without apology, without satisfaction. Just fact. He was testing how much you'd already figured out. When you didn't mention me directly, he knew you were still working it out. Dante turned away from her and put both hands flat on the wine rack and breathed. The basement smelled of stone and old wood, and the faint, particular cold of underground spaces. He concentrated on the smell because it was something he could actually locate, something with weight and dimension, unlike everything else that was currently rearranging itself inside his understanding. "How long?" he said. "Marcus, I first noticed the pattern 8 months ago. I had it confirmed 5 months ago." 5 months, he said. "Yes. And you didn't tell me." The pause that followed was not long, but it was precise. "I told you what I thought you were ready to hear, Dante. You weren't ready for this." He turned back around. His voice came out quieter than he expected, which was worse somehow than if he'd shouted. "That wasn't your decision to make." "No," she said. "It wasn't. But I made it anyway, because the alternative was watching you confront Marcus without enough information, and give him the chance to run before we had everything we needed." Her eyes held his. "I was protecting the organization. You were protecting yourself." "Yes," she said. "That too." They stood in the basement of the Veyron estate, 5 feet apart, and the history between them occupied the space like a third person. 11 years of mornings and silences, and the specific texture of a shared life. And underneath all of it, this, the architecture of what she'd actually been doing, the patience of it, scale. Dante's phone buzzed. He looked at it. A message from a number he didn't recognize. 4 words. She burned the ledger, frowned at it. What does this mean? He held the phone toward her. Serafina read it without touching the phone. Her expression didn't change, but something moved in her jaw, a tightening, a decision being made. It means someone inside the organization is communicating with the Batiste network, and they're telling them something that isn't true. She looked up. "I haven't burned anything yet," Dante said. She looked at him steadily. "Yet." He pocketed the phone. "So whoever sent this is running disinformation. To who? Why?" "To make the Batiste people hesitate," she said. "Or to accelerate them, depending on whose side the sender is actually on." She moved toward the stairs. "We need Rocco. Rocco isn't answering my calls. He'll answer mine." She pulled her own phone and dialed without looking at the screen, which meant the number was memorized, which meant she'd called it enough times that she didn't need to think about it. Dante watched her stand at the foot of the basement stairs with the phone at her ear and thought about all the times he'd believed Rocco Marcelli was his man. "Where are you?" she said into the phone. Not a question, a location request, clipped and direct. She listened for a moment. "Come in through the garden passage. Don't use the main gate." Another pause. "Because Marcus Webb is on the cameras, and I don't want him to know you're here." She hung up. Dante said, "You think Marcus is watching the cameras? Think Marcus has been feeding camera data to the Batiste network for at least 2 months. I think when Batiste's people move tonight, they'll know exactly which entrances are monitored and which ones aren't." Except, she glanced at him. "The basement passage exits don't appear on the camera grid. Your grandfather made sure of that." He thought of everything, Dante said, and his voice had something involuntary in it, something that might, in a different moment, have been the beginning of grief. "He thought of the things that mattered," Serafina said. "He just ran out of time to tell you about them." They waited. Basement was quiet except for the sound of the building settling and the distant, barely there hum of the city beyond the estate walls. Dante sat on one of the wooden storage crates and rubbed the back of his neck and tried to think straight. His mind kept snagging on Celeste, on the specific quality of her smile the night before, the way she'd held his hand when he pulled her forward into the dining room, the warmth of it, calculated warmth. He understood now. Warmth deployed with precision, and the humiliation of that understanding had a particular flavor, chalky and acidic, that sat at the back of his throat. He'd thought he was choosing something better. He'd been chosen, used, walked into a position where his own desire for control had handed his enemies a door. The panel in the far wall opened. Rocco came through it sideways, coat dusty from the passage, and straightened when he saw both of them. His eyes went to Dante first, not with guilt, exactly, but with the careful, assessing look of a man who doesn't know yet how a conversation is going to go. Dante said, "You declined my calls, I know," Rocco said. "You want to tell me why?" Rocco looked at Serafina. Serafina gave him nothing, no signal, no permission, no rescue. He looked back at Dante. "Because when you called, I was already in a conversation I couldn't interrupt. And because I needed to know what she wanted me to say to you before I said anything. The honesty of it landed harder than a lie would have. Dante felt it in his chest. How long? Dante said. Rocco didn't pretend not to understand the question. She came to me 4 years ago, he said. With something I'd done that. He stopped. Started again. With something that would have ended badly for me if it had come to you first. She didn't use it as a weapon. She sat down with me, and she talked to me, like I was a person who'd made a mistake instead of a liability to be managed. He set his jaw. After that, yeah, I listened to her, more than I listened to you. Not because I stopped caring about this family, because I never stopped caring about this family, but because she was right more often than you were, and I knew it. Dante stood up from the crate. He was taller than Rocco, and he used that in the way men do without thinking, the physical language of authority, and Rocco didn't step back. He held his ground, not aggressively, just steadily, the way a man stands when he's already decided he's going to say the true thing regardless of the cost. And the warehouse, Dante said. Last night, the accounts. She asked me to help with the logistics. I did. Rocco's voice was level. Because if you went through with the divorce, with Celeste, this organization was going to be handed to the Batiste network on a plate. She was protecting it. I was protecting it. He looked at Dante without apology. You were dismantling it. The silence afterward was the kind that either breaks into violence or into something else. Dante's hands were fists at his sides. His breathing was audible in the quiet of the basement, each breath a little harder to keep even than the last. Serafina said, Dante. He looked at her. We have about 4 hours, she said. You can be angry at Rocco tonight and for as long afterward as you need. But right now, I need both of you functional. She moved to the schematic table and spread the paper out again. The Batiste team will come in from the north and east. They'll have the camera data Marcus fed them, which means they'll believe the East Garden is a blind spot. It's not. I had additional units installed in 2021 that aren't on the original grid. Rocco moved to the table. After a moment, Dante moved too. How many? Rocco said. Their usual assault team is 12 to 15. Batiste doesn't overcommit on these, he thinks. It looks sloppy. She tapped the schematic. That's his mistake. He's been running the same approach for 6 years. You've studied him, Dante said. I've studied everyone who might eventually become a problem. She said it without looking up from the paper. What I do, Dante. It's what I've always done. Dante looked at her, bent over the schematic, her finger moving along the passage lines, and he thought about the word always. He thought about what it meant in the context of 11 years. He thought about the version of himself that had sat at the head of that dinner table and believed he was in control of all of it. He put his hands on the table across from her and leaned in. Captains, he said. The ones still loyal to me, actually loyal to me. Not to you, how many? Serafina looked up. You mean how many captains are loyal to you rather than to me? Yes. She held his gaze for a count of 3 seconds. 2. Possibly 3. The number hit him. He'd had 11 active captains. He let himself feel it, the full weight of it for about 5 seconds. And then he put it somewhere internal that he'd deal with later, after they survived the night. Celeste, he said. Where is she? West Wing guest room, Serafina said. She doesn't know what I know about her. As far as she's concerned, she's waiting for you to come back with the details about the divorce arrangements. She's been in this house all day? Yes. Dante straightened. The muscles across his shoulders were rigid, the specific tension of a man holding himself together through physical effort. I want to talk to her. No, Serafina said. Serafina, not because I'm protecting you from her, she said, her voice cutting through his cleanly. Because if you confront her right now, she'll panic and contact Batiste. She'll tell them we know. They'll move earlier than planned and we won't be ready. She looked at him without softness. You can confront Celeste Arden after tonight. I promise you that conversation will happen, but not now. Dante looked at his wife and hated her, briefly, for being right again. What do you need from me? He said. The question cost him something. She heard at the cost and she didn't exploit it, didn't let any satisfaction show. She just pointed to the schematic. The south passage connects to the armory storage. I need you to verify the inventory and make sure nothing's been moved or tampered with. Rocco will reach out to the captains I trust. I need them in position by 9. She looked at her watch. 4:15. Dante took the flashlight Rocco pulled from his coat pocket and held it out, and he walked to the south passage without another word. The door was heavy and cold, and it swung on hinges that were better maintained than they had any right to be, which told him something about the frequency with which they'd been used. He moved through the passage and let the dark close behind him. 30 feet in, the passage widened slightly, and there was a door on the left. Behind it, shelving. Cases of equipment, all of it organized, labeled, inventoried by hand on a sheet pinned to the inside of the door. He stood with the flashlight and read through the list and cross-checked it against the physical contents and found it all present and accounted for, and then he found one addition. Something not on the original list, added in a handwriting that wasn't his and wasn't Rocco's. A small black device, roughly rectangular, tucked behind one of the cases on the second shelf. He recognized it. Signal transmitter. Short range, battery-powered, the kind used to relay location data. He stood with the flashlight aimed at it and felt the cold of the passage on the back of his neck. Someone had been broadcasting their position from inside the armory for however long this device had been here. He picked it up with 2 fingers, carried it back to the main room, and set it on the schematic table without speaking. Rocco and Serafina both looked at it. Rocco's face went carefully blank in the way of a man controlling a reaction. Serafina said, "Where?" "Behind the equipment cases on the second shelf," Dante said. "Not on the inventory sheet." She picked it up and turned it over, examined the serial mark on the back. She set it face down on the table and pressed her thumb against the surface, as if she was considering something, and then she looked at Rocco. "The South Passage," she said. "Who else knew about it?" "You, me, Gerald," Rocco said, "and Marcus." The name sat in the room like a dropped stone. "Marcus knew about the passage," Dante said. "We had to tell him," Rocco said. 2 years ago, the East Passage needed maintenance, and we rerouted the captain meetings through the South. He was there." He paused. "I should have. You couldn't have known then," Serafina said. She picked up the transmitter, walked to the utility sink in the corner of the basement, held it under the tap, and let the water run over it for 15 seconds. Then she set it on the edge of the sink and walked back. "The signal's dead. But Batiste already has everything it broadcast. We have to assume they know the passage network exists. Not the specifics, this thing doesn't have GPS, just presence confirmation, but they know there's infrastructure they weren't accounting for." "Which changes their approach," Rocco said. "Which changes their approach," she agreed. Dante said, "Where is Marcus right now?" Serafina pulled her phone, looked at something on the screen, set it face down on the table. "He left the estate 40 minutes ago. He used his standard departure protocol, so the camera log shows a normal end of shift. He's gone to meet someone," Dante said. "Yes, the Batista team. Almost certainly." Dante felt the walls of the situation closing in, not with panic, but with a kind of grim, clarifying pressure. This was what he understood, not the patience of it, not the architecture of what Serafina had built over years, but this. The moment when the information was complete enough to move, when the shape of the threat became specific enough to act against. This was the only territory where he'd ever felt genuinely competent, and he recognized it now with something close to relief. The relief of a man who's been standing on unfamiliar ground and finally finds a surface he knows how to walk on. "All right," he said. He picked up the schematic. "Walk me through the East Passage entry points. All of them. Everything they don't know we know." Serafina watched him for a moment. Just a moment. Then she moved to the table, and they stood together over the paper, and she started talking, and he actually listened, without the defensive processing of a man trying to maintain dominance over the information, and the hours began to move. Upstairs, the estate was quiet. In the West Wing guest room, Celeste Arden sat on the edge of a made bed and looked at her phone and composed and deleted 3 separate messages to a number saved under the name R. Flowers, she couldn't find the right words. She didn't know what she was feeling, exactly not guilt. She wasn't built for guilt in any useful quantity, but something adjacent to it, some awareness of the gap between what she'd told Dante Veyron he was and what she privately understood him to be. He wasn't a fool. He'd been a fool in the specific blind spot of wanting to believe someone desired him for what he was rather than what he controlled. But he wasn't, structurally, a fool. And for the first time since she'd taken this assignment, she felt the particular unease of someone who has underestimated a target's environment without adequately accounting for the people in it. Thought about Serafina, the dinner. The wedding ring removed and set on the table, like a period at the end of a sentence. She deleted the fourth draft of her message and put the phone in her pocket and went to the window and looked out at the estate grounds, going dark under the early evening sky. Something felt wrong. Not the assignment. The assignment was on track. She'd told herself that all day. But there was a quality to the quiet of this house that she couldn't explain. The specific absence of the sounds she expected: staff movement, the distant bass note of men's conversations, the mechanical sounds of a large property in operation. The house felt held, like a breath being kept. She put her hand on the door handle. Locked. She tried it twice to be sure. It didn't move. She hadn't heard anyone lock it. The mechanism had been turned from outside, quietly, while she'd been at the window or in the bathroom or looking at her phone. And now she was standing in a guest room on the second floor of the Veyron estate as the daylight failed. And somewhere below her, the woman she'd spent 4 months helping to displace was in the same building. And the door was locked, and the house was holding its breath. Celeste Arden sat back down on the edge of the bed. For the first time in this assignment, she was not the most dangerous person in her immediate situation. She understood that now. She understood it with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had just realized, too late, that the game she thought she'd been playing had a different board entirely, and that the woman who'd laid it out had been watching her move pieces across it for months, patient and quiet and absolutely, completely, waiting for exactly this moment to close the door. The lock on the guest room door was the least of Celeste Arden's problems, and some of the part of her mind that had kept her alive through 4 years of this kind of work. She already knew it. She sat on the edge of the bed and did what she always did. When a situation shifted against her, she inventoried. Phone still working. Signal intact. 2 bars. Window second floor, 12-foot drop to a stone terrace. Manageable if necessary. Door locked from outside. Solid core. Not something she was breaking through without tools she didn't have. She had 40 minutes of battery left on the secondary device, in her coat lining. The one that wasn't her primary phone. The one that connected directly to the Batiste network's encrypted channel. Pulled the coat from the chair where she'd draped it, found the device in the lining by feel, powered it on. One message waiting. Sent 42 minutes ago. It read, timeline moved up. 2 hours. Confirm position. She stared at the message. 2 hours. That put the Batista team on the estate grounds by 8:30 at the latest, and it was already past 6. Something had changed in their calculus. Something had told them to accelerate, and she had a tight, acidic certainty about what that something was. The transmitter in the armory. Whoever had placed it had also been tracking when it went dark, and when it went dark without warning in the middle of a routine broadcast cycle. That was information. That was. They found it, which meant they know more than we thought, which meant move now before they finish preparing. Type back. Confirmed. Interior secure. It was a lie on 2 counts. She was not secure, and the interior was absolutely not under her control. But she needed the Batiste team moving on their timeline, not an accelerated one, because she needed time to think. She powered the device down and put it back in the coat lining. Then she sat very still and thought about Serafina Veyron. Downstairs, Serafina already knew about the secondary device. She'd known about it for 11 days. Gerald Otis had flagged a signal anomaly from the West Wing guest room during a West routine sweep. He ran every 2 weeks, a sweep that Dante had never asked for and therefore never known about. The signal was faint, irregular, the kind of thing that looked like interference, if you weren't specifically looking for encrypted short-burst transmission. Gerald was specifically looking. He'd brought the data to Serafina on a Tuesday morning, and she'd looked at it over coffee and said, "Don't touch it. Don't tell anyone. Let it run." She had used the 11 days to verify everything she needed to verify about Celeste Arden, the DeLuca connection, the Batiste network. The specific intelligence Celeste said had already transmitted financial routing information, the captain roster, Dante's weekly schedule, the location of 2 of the family's off-books properties. Celeste had been efficient and thorough, and Serafina had found herself, in a detached professional way, almost impressed. Now Serafina stood in the basement and watched Dante work through the schematic and thought about timing. Not the timing of the attack she had that managed. He'd had it, managed for a week, but the timing of what she needed to tell him next. Thing that was going to be worse than Celeste. The thing that would complete the picture of how his world had been constructed around him without his knowledge, and how much of that construction had been hers. She waited until he'd finished marking the schematic. "There's something else," she said. Dante looked up. He was starting to read her now. She could see it, the way his attention sharpened when she used that particular flat tone. He was learning, in real time, what her different registers meant. It was the kind of learning that should have happened years ago, and she felt a complex, unsentimentalized sadness about that before she set it aside. "The Vale bloodline," she said. "My grandfather's original agreement with Enzo Veyron." "You read the document in the study." "The founding records," Dante said. "Yes. There's a second document," she said. "Enzo's private file. Not in the study, he gave it to me, directly. In 2016, the night he showed me the passage schematics. It outlines the terms of the original Vale Veyron agreement. Specifically, the succession clause." Dante set down the pencil he'd been using to mark exit routes. "What succession clause?" "The Vale family provided the organizational structure that made the Veyron operation viable. In exchange, the agreement specified that in the event the Veyron male line took an action that materially endangered, defined in the document, as any decision that introduced an external threat that compromised internal loyalty or destabilized, the financial structure authority was to revert." She looked at him, without apology, without drama. "To the Vale heir." Dante's face did something complicated. "Enzo agreed to that. Enzo wrote it. It was his idea. He didn't trust your father, Dante. He loved him, but he didn't trust what your father's ambition would eventually cost the family. He built in a safeguard." She paused. "The divorce announcement. The decision to bring Celeste into the estate. The account irregularities that followed all of it qualifies under the document's language." "You triggered it," Dante said. His voice was very quiet. "Conditions triggered it. I didn't have to do anything except let you make the decisions you were going to make anyway." He picked the pencil back up and set it down again, a gesture without purpose. The physical expression of a man whose hands don't know what to do with what his mind is processing. "You've had this document for 10 years. "Yes. "And you waited." "Told you. I was waiting to see which version of you would show up." She sat down on one of the storage crates, which was unusual. She almost never sat during operational planning. He'd noticed that in the past hour, and he understood it as a deliberate choice, a de-escalation. "The document doesn't require me to take anything from you. It's not a weapon. It's a structure. It means that what I'm doing right now, organizing the defense of this estate, coordinating the captains, preparing the response to Batiste, is something I'm doing with full organizational authority. Not as your wife acting above her station. As the legitimate head of this family, acting within the terms that built it." Dante leaned back against the wine rack. The cold of the stone came through his jacket. He looked at the ceiling, at the low beams and the old stone of the estate foundation, and he thought about legitimacy. He'd spent his entire adult life understanding himself as legitimate, as the inheritor of something real, something built and earned and handed to him by bloodline and sacrifice. And now he was standing in the basement of his own estate, understanding that the legitimacy he'd assumed was actually on loan, that it had always been conditional, that there was a clause in the original agreement, and he had walked directly, with open eyes and enormous confidence, into every condition that clause required. "Why are you telling me this now?" he said. "Tonight, with Batiste, 4 hours out." "'Cause after tonight things change," she said. "And I need you to go into what's coming, knowing exactly what the situation is. No more partial information. No more managed disclosure." She looked at him steadily. "I owe you that much." "You owe me that much," he repeated. "Yes, I do. I made choices about what to tell you, and when, and some of those choices were about protecting the organization, and some of them were about protecting myself, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." She held his gaze. "I'm also not going to apologize for the ones that were necessary. But yes, I owe you clarity, so that's the situation. Dante said nothing for almost a full minute. Rocco, who had been standing near the passage door with the diplomatic stillness of a man trying to take up as little space as possible, shifted his weight slightly and then went still again. Then Dante said, Celeste transmitted to Battisti tonight. Serafina's attention sharpened. You know that how? I don't know it. I'm inferring it. The timeline moved you, said Battisti was planning tonight, but you didn't say 2 hours. 2 hours? A beat. Yes. Then something triggered the acceleration, the transmitter going dark. She felt the shift in the house, and she confirmed her position to buy time. He pushed off the wine rack. She's working her own angle right now. In that room. She's not just waiting. Serafina looked at him, and in her expression was something that might on another face have been called approval. Not warm, but real. Gerald is monitoring the signal from the guest room, she said. If she transmits again, we'll know within 90 seconds. That's not fast enough, Dante said. I need to go up there. I said, no, I know what you said. I'm telling you the calculus has changed. He moved to the stairs. Thinks I'm still in the dark about her. She thinks I'm upstairs, somewhere regretting the dinner, working myself up to another conversation with you. About terms. If I go in there and play the man she thinks I am, I can find out exactly what Battisti knows and what their entry approach is. Information you don't have. Serafina stood up. If you tip her, I won't tip her. He stopped on the second step and looked back at her. I spent 8 months believing she was something she wasn't. I know exactly what she expects from me. I can give her that for 20 minutes. Serafina and Rocco exchanged a look. The look had history in it, shorthand developed over years of working together, and Dante saw it and felt the particular sting of being the outsider in a room that bore his name. But he didn't say anything about it. 20 minutes, Serafina said. Rocco will be outside the door. Dante went upstairs. He found the key on the hook inside the kitchen cabinet where the estate kept spare hardware, selected the right one by number, and went down the west wing corridor. He stopped outside the guest room and breathed once, slowly, and arranged his face into something that cost him more than he expected, the face of a man still confused, still processing, still reaching for something he thought was real. He unlocked the door and went in. Celeste was standing at the window. She turned when he entered, and her face assembled itself in about half a second: concern, relief, the particular softness of someone who needs you to believe they've been worried about you. She was very good at it. He'd believed it for 8 months. I thought something happened, she said. She came toward him, reached for his hand. He let her take it. Her grip was warm and firm and told him nothing about what she was actually feeling. You were gone all day. Things are complicated, he said. He let himself look tired. It wasn't difficult. Serafina's making moves. Counts. Some of the captains, she's been planning this longer than I realized. Celeste's thumb moved across his knuckles, soothing, practiced. How bad is it? Bad enough. He sat on the chair near the window and looked out at the grounds. The light was gone now, the estate reduced to the pools of illumination from the perimeter lights and the dark beyond them. She's more connected than I understood. Some of the people I thought were mine. He shook his head, let the sentence die, watched Celeste in his peripheral vision. She sat on the edge of the bed facing him. Her posture was exactly right, present, attentive, worried but steady. Posture of someone who wants you to lean on them. What do you need? She said. I need to know if there's anything I've missed, he said. He turned to look at her directly. Anything in the last few months. Anything that seemed off or that didn't fit. He let the statement breathe. You've been watching this family from the outside. Fresh eyes. Tell me what you saw that I didn't. Celeste held his gaze for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, he saw the calculation happening behind her eyes. Not guilt, not discomfort, just the rapid processing of someone deciding how much to give and in what form. She thought she was managing him. She thought he was where she'd left him. In the dark, reaching for her. Grateful. She's been isolating you, Celeste said slowly. Your captains, the people around you, she's built relationships with all of them separately from you, over years. She leaned forward slightly. Her voice was earnest and calibrated. The dinner last night, I think she let it happen. I think she wanted you to make that announcement in front of the elders. Didn't hurt her. It set something in motion. Dante nodded slowly. You knew about her before last night. I suspected, Celeste said. I didn't want to say anything without being sure. I didn't want to upset you over a suspicion. Right, he said. You were protecting me. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. She held the look without difficulty, which was itself a kind of data point. Then he said, the Batista Network. Tell me what they know about the estate's internal layout. The temperature in the room changed in an instant. Not dramatically. Celeste was too controlled for drama, but the quality of her stillness shifted. The fraction of a second before she responded was a fraction of a second too long. I don't know what you mean, she said. Yes, you do, he said. Found the device in the armory. Gerald Oates identified your transmission signal from this room 11 days ago. He watched her face go through the full sequence. Denial preparation, assessment, recalibration. You've been feeding them financial routing. The captain roster, my weekly schedule, the off-books properties on Kinsey and Harlow. He leaned forward. I want to know what else. And I want to know their entry approach for tonight. Celeste was quiet. Her hands, which had been folded in her lap, moved slightly, not toward anything, just a micro-adjustment, a person finding balance on new ground. You won't hurt me, she said. It wasn't a plea. It was an assessment. No, he said. I won't. But the woman downstairs might have a different view of that question, and in about 10 minutes, she's going to walk through that door, and the conversation is going to be considerably less comfortable. Celeste looked at the door. She looked back at Dante. North and east approach, she said. 15 men. They have the exterior camera grid, the one on your system, the official one. They know about the East Garden coverage gap. She said it without visible emotion, the voice of a professional completing a task. The team lead is a man named Sauer. He's ex-military. He runs a tight operation. He'll take the gatehouse first to neutralize external communication and then move on the main building simultaneously from 3 points. Passages, Dante said. Do they know about the underground passages? Celeste's jaw tightened by a millimeter. I gave them confirmation that infrastructure existed, not specifics. From the armory transmitter. Yes. Dante stood up. He moved to the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her. Who recruited you? Originally. Was it Batista himself? She looked at him steadily. No, she said. It was Marcus Webb. The name hit him differently than he expected, not shock. He was past shock, but a cold, specific anger that moved through his chest like something swallowed wrong. Marcus Webb had not just been feeding data to Batista. He had built the architecture of the infiltration. He had recruited Celeste, positioned her, run her as an asset inside the DeLuca network, with Dante as the target from the beginning. 6 years, Dante thought. He'd given Marcus Webb 6 years. He left the room, locked it behind him, found Rocco in the corridor. Marcus recruited her, Dante said. Rocco's face did something complicated. I didn't know that part. Where is he now? Last confirmed position was a parking structure on the north side. 2 hours ago. Rocco fell into step beside him. He could be anywhere. They went downstairs and Dante told Serafina what Celeste had said. She listened without interrupting, standing at the schematic table with her arms crossed and her eyes on the middle distance, processing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Sauer, she said. I know that name. He ran the Batista assault on the Mercier family in New Orleans in 2021. Killed 4 people and made it look like an internal dispute. She unfolded her arms. He's not coming here to negotiate. No, Dante said. And Marcus is coordinating from outside, she said, which means he has a secondary role communication relay between Sauer's team and someone else. Someone else, Rocco said. Not Batista directly. Batista doesn't leave New Orleans for operations. He has a local contact. She looked at the schematic. Someone who knows this estate's specific geography well enough to guide Sauer's team in real time. She was quiet for 3 seconds. Someone who's been here repeatedly. Dante said, Give me names. I only have one, she said. And the way she said it, the particular flatness of it, the held quality told him before she said the name that this was the thing she'd been holding back. Thing that was going to be worse than all the rest of it. Gerald Oates, she said. Rocco made a sound. Dante stood very still. Gerald found the transmitter signal 11 days ago, she said. I told you that. What I didn't tell you is that I had the signal analyzed. Gerald brought me the report. But the analysis showed the signal had two components, the Celeste transmission and a secondary signal coming from a different source. Older, more established. Her voice was completely level. The secondary signal was being broadcast from Gerald's personal device. He's been transmitting estate financial data and internal communication logs to a Batiste-affiliated account for 14 months. 14 months. Dante did the math without wanting to. 14 months ago, he had trusted Gerald Oates with the restructuring of the family's entire financial architecture, a consolidation Dante had been proud of, a system he'd believed made them stronger. Gerald had helped build it. Gerald had understood every mechanism of it. And for 14 of those months, every piece of that architecture had been broadcast to Vincent Batisti's network in New Orleans. He's not outside with Marcus, Dante said. No, Serafina said. He's in the estate. He came back through the North Service entrance 40 minutes ago. He told the gate log he forgot documents. She looked at Dante. He's here to make sure the passage network is accessible to Sauer's team from inside. Dante moved toward the stairs. Serafina caught his arm. Not forcefully, just the grip of a hand, a contact, a stop. He's not alone, she said. Two of the men he brought in are Batistes. They're posing as Gerald's personal security. They've been in the building for 40 minutes, and I don't know exactly where they are. Dante looked at her hand on his arm and then at her face. You should have told me all of this sooner, he said. Yes, she said. I should have. It was the first time she'd said anything like that. No qualification, no context. Just yes. The honesty of it hit him somewhere unexpected, somewhere he didn't have a name for. We're out of time for what I should have done, she said. We're in the time for what we do next. Her hand released his arm. Gerald knows this basement. He knows the passages. He knows the armory location, the captain positioning schedule, the schematic he drew 2 of those maps himself in 2019. She looked at the table where the schematic lay. Everything we've been planning for the past 3 hours. He knows. The full weight of it settled. Dante looked at Rocco, who looked back at him with an expression stripped of everything except the bare fact of the situation. Captain's in position, Dante said. The approach we planned. All of it, Serafina said. They'll be walking into it. Yes. The basement was very quiet. Somewhere above them, in the body of the estate, Edith, Gerald Oates, and 2 of Vincent Batisti's men were moving through rooms that Gerald knew as well as his own house. The passages that were supposed to be their advantage were now mapped for the enemy. Captain positions that were supposed to catch Sauer's team exposed were now known. The entire defensive architecture that Serafina had spent hours constructing around her detailed knowledge of the estate's secrets had just been handed, in its entirety, to the people it was designed to stop. Dante reached out and picked up the schematic from the table. He held it for a moment. Then, he folded it carefully along its original creases, the way you fold something you're going to need in a different form later. We scrap the plan, he said. Serafina and Rocco were both looking at him. We scrap everything we built on the assumption that the passages were ours, he said. Build something new, right now, with whatever they don't know. He set the folded schematic down and looked at his wife. What does Gerald not know? Serafina looked at him for a long moment. The quality of the look was different from anything he'd seen from her in 11 years, not the cool assessment, not the patient management. Something rawer, something that might have been the look of a person who has spent a very long time being the most prepared person in the room and has just been handed a problem that preparation alone cannot solve. The camera units I installed in 2021, she said slowly. He doesn't know their specific positions. Never filed the installation report internally. She paused. And there's one passage he doesn't know about. One. Enzo showed it to me separately, the week before he died. He made me promise not to put it on any document. Her voice was careful. I've never told anyone. Not Rocco. Not Gerald. Rocco, to his credit, showed nothing. Where does it go? Dante said. Serafina looked at him, at the man she had outmaneuvered for years, who had betrayed her at a dinner table in front of 12 witnesses, who had chosen appetite over everything they'd built, and she made a decision that she understood was irreversible. "It goes under the north garden," she said, "and comes up inside the gatehouse." Dante looked at the folded schematic and then back at her. "Then that's where we start," he said. And for the first time, since the estate doors had closed around them both, they were building something together, not her architecture, with him occupying space inside it, not his authority, with her managing it from the periphery, but something assembled in the specific, dangerous urgency of a moment when everything that was supposed to protect them had been stripped away, leaving only what they each knew and what they were each willing to risk, and the narrow passage that neither of them could walk through alone. The passage Serafina had never told anyone about was narrower than the others, narrow enough that both of them had to turn slightly sideways in certain sections, the stone pressing cold against their shoulders and backs. She led. Dante followed. Neither of them spoke. She'd brought a flashlight from the basement kit. Beam moved ahead of them, across the rough stone floor, and Dante watched the back of her head, the set of her shoulders, the way she moved through the dark, without hesitating at the turns. She'd walked this once, maybe twice, 14 years ago, with a dying old man who'd made her promise. She remembered every foot of it. He filed that away, with everything else he was filing. The passage ran for roughly 120 feet before it angled upward and ended at a wooden panel with a simple iron latch. Serafina put her ear against it and listened for 15 seconds. Then she lifted the latch and eased the panel open 2 inches and listened again. The gatehouse interior. Empty. The single overhead light was on, casting the small room in pale yellow. The guard station monitors showed the exterior camera feeds the official grid, the one Marcus had been feeding to Batiste's team. On screen 4, the East Garden looked dark and unmonitored, exactly as Marcus had told them. Serafina came through first, then Dante. He eased the panel closed behind them and looked at the monitors. 3 of the feeds were wrong. Not obviously wrong. Subtly wrong. The timestamp in the corner of feed 7 was running 30 seconds behind the others, and the image on feed 3 had a quality of stillness that outdoor footage at night doesn't actually have. Someone had replaced live feeds with recorded loops. The East Garden wasn't dark and unmonitored. Someone had already been in the gatehouse and swapped the feeds. "They're already inside the perimeter," Dante said. Serafina leaned over the monitors. Her jaw tightened. How long those loops the timestamp gap on 7 minimum 40 minutes. She straightened and pulled her phone and called Rocco. "North Quadrant," she said when he answered. "They're already inside. Move the captains to the secondary positions." She listened. "I know. Do it now." She hung up and looked at Dante. Rocco had 2 captains on the north approach. If Sauer's team has been inside 40 minutes, those men. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. A message from a number logged as Captain Ferris, one of the 2 she'd positioned north. The message was a single character, a period. The estate's emergency signal. 1 period meant down. 2 captains. Gone. She pocketed the phone, and the look on her face was the look of someone absorbing a hit without letting it take her legs. Dante watched it happen, watched her process the loss in real time. 2 people she'd organized and trusted, reduced to a period on a screen, and he saw the effort it took to keep moving. "Where does Sauer go first?" Dante said. "If his team is already inside, and Gerald's given him the layout." "Main hall," she said. "He'll want to control the central space before he moves to the wings. Force everyone into a single point." She was already moving toward the gatehouse door. "Gerald will try to bring him to the basement through the east passage, to show him the schematic, to show him everything we built, so we can't go back through the passage." "No." She opened the door a crack and looked out. The estate grounds between the gatehouse and the main building were 40 meters of open space, lit in patches by the perimeter lights and dark in between. "We go across. Stay in the dark sections. The 2021 cameras will track us, but they won't track them. Sauer's team doesn't know where those lenses are. How many of our people are left operational?" Dante said. "Rocco, 4 captains at secondary positions. And us," she said. 6 people against 15. He did the math and didn't say it out loud. "Go," she said. They went. The 40 meters of open ground took about 30 seconds and felt longer. Dante moved the way he hadn't moved since he was 25, low and fast, cutting through the pools of dark between the lights. His dress shoes were wrong. For this the leather soles slipped slightly on the damp grass, and he kept himself upright through a combination of muscle memory and the animal imperative of not stopping. Serafina moved beside him without a sound, her dark jacket swallowing the light, and they hit the shadow of the main building's east wall and stopped there together, breathing. His back was against the stone. Hers was too. Their arms were touching. He could feel her breathing controlled, deliberate, the breathing of someone who has decided pain is not available to her. Side entrance, she said, barely audible. 30 feet. Kitchen corridor. There's a burst of sound from inside the building. Not a gunshot, a crash. Something large and solid hitting a floor. And then a man's voice, clipped and directive. The consonants of someone used to giving orders in tight spaces. Sour. Already in the main hall. Serafina moved to the side entrance without discussion. The door was unlocked. She'd propped it herself. Earlier, as part of the plan that no longer existed, and they were inside the kitchen corridor in seconds, the door easing shut behind them. Kitchen was dark. The corridor beyond it showed light from the main hall, cut into moving shapes by people passing in front of it. Dante counted shadows. 3, 4, 5. That was the main hall. It meant the rest of Sauer's team was distributed through the estate wing, the stairwell's floor. His phone vibrated. Rocco, 2 tangos on east stairwell. Captain Yoon down. Moving to contain. 3 captains now. Against 15. Dante typed back. Main hall has 5 minimum. We're in kitchen corridor. Then he pocketed the phone and touched Serafina's sleeve and pointed toward the main hall. She shook her head and pointed upward. He frowned. She held up 2 fingers and pointed to the ceiling, 2 people directly above them, on the 2nd floor. She'd heard something he hadn't, or she was working from a logic he was a half-second behind on. She pointed to herself, then upward. Then she pointed to him, then toward the main hall. He looked at her in the dark of the kitchen corridor and understood that she was telling him to split up, and everything in him resisted it. The specific resistance of a man who has just spent 3 hours understanding how much he'd underestimated the person beside him, and is not prepared to send her up a staircase alone against 2 unknown contacts. She held his gaze and made the gesture again. Patient, firm, not asking. He nodded. She went left toward the back stairwell. He went right toward the light of the main hall. He stopped at the edge of the corridor and looked around the door frame. The main hall was large, 30 feet across. The chandelier overhead, the double staircase at the far end. 4 men in tactical positions, wearing dark clothing with no insignia, moving with the practiced economy of trained personnel. A 5th near the door to the east corridor, which led to the basement passage, standing guard, waiting. In the center of the room, sitting in one of the hall chairs with his hands in his lap and his expression carefully neutral, was Gerald Oates. Dante looked at Gerald for a long moment. Gerald, who had worked for the family for 22 years. Gerald, who had come to Marco Veyron's funeral and wept in a way that Dante had thought was genuine and now couldn't evaluate. Gerald, who had sat across the kitchen table from Dante in 2018 during the federal investigation and helped him understand the exposure and the pathways through it, who had spent 3 days mapping the family's financial structure in a way that was thorough and brilliant, and apparently had a second function that Dante had not been equipped to see. One of Sauer's men said something to Gerald in a low voice. Gerald nodded and said, "The basement access is through that corridor. The passage entrance is concealed behind the wine rack. I'll show you." Dante's hand went to the inside of his jacket. He'd taken a weapon from the armory kit, a compact thing, unfamiliar weight in a familiar shape. He hadn't used one in 4 years. His grip on it was not quite right, and he adjusted it in the dark of the corridor and breathed once. He needed a way to pull at least 2 of Sauer's men out of the main hall without exposing himself. He needed it in the next 30 seconds, before Gerald stood up and walked them into the basement and found the room empty and the schematic gone and understood that the plan had moved. He went back through the kitchen, out the side door, back into the cold of the estate grounds, and ran to the far edge of the building. The east corridor had a window old, single pane, the kind with a latch that hadn't worked properly since 2017. He'd meant to have it fixed. He'd never gotten around to it. He worked the latch with the blade of his keys in the dark, and the window swung inward and he was through it and in the east corridor in under a minute. He found the breaker panel 3 doors down. He'd installed the updated system in 19, had spent 2 hours with the electrician understanding which circuits controlled which zones. He opened the panel and in the dark, by feel, found the breakers for the main hall lighting and the east corridor and threw them both. The building went dark in sections. He heard voices immediately commands, movement, the specific sound of professional men reconfiguring to a changed environment. He was already moving back toward the main hall, through the dark corridor, his hand on the wall, counting doors by touch. He came through the main hall doorway and hit the first person he found with the shoulder, a full-body collision that sent them both into the wall. The man was larger than him and recovered faster, a forearm across Dante's throat before Dante could get his footing, and for 4 seconds it was pure physical struggle in the dark, the man's breath hot on his face, the wall hard against his spine. Dante drove his knee upward, the grip on his throat released. He shoved the man sideways and moved out of reach, and the darkness helped him the same way. It helped the other side and neither of them could see, which meant the trained professional's advantage was partially cancelled. He got to where Gerald had been sitting. Empty chair. Gerald was gone. A flashlight beam cut through the far end of the hall. Then another. Sauer's men reorganizing, finding their light sources. Dante dropped low and moved along the wall toward the staircase. A hand caught his collar from above, and he grabbed the wrist by reflex and heard Rocco's voice say quietly, "It's me." Rocco pulled him up 2 steps. They crouched together on the staircase in the dark, below the level of the flashlight beams. "Yungwen's actually okay," Rocco murmured. "Took a hit, but he's mobile. He's covering the north exit. Gerald's moving for the basement," Dante said. "He has at least one of Sauer's men with him." "Serafina?" "Second floor. There are 2 of them up there," Rocco said. "I know." Rocco's face was a shape in the dark. "She went up alone." "Yes." A pause of about 1 second. "Okay," Rocco said, which was not agreement. It was the voice of a man who has made his peace with something he can't change. "Gerald can't get to the basement without going through the east corridor. We can get ahead of him." The lights came back on. Not all of them. The main hall stayed dark. The east corridor stayed dark, but the secondary lighting, the emergency fixtures that ran on a separate circuit, clicked on through the estate and gave everything a flat, institutional gray illumination. Enough to see by. Enough to lose the cover of the dark. Dante and Rocco were visible on the staircase. 2 of Sauer's men in the main hall saw them at the same moment. "Move," Dante said. They went up the stairs. A shot hit the banister 2 feet below Rocco's hand, not a firearm shot, a compressed air weapon, quieter, which told Dante that Sauer's team was operating under noise restrictions, which meant there was someone outside the estate whose attention they didn't want to attract. That was information. He filed it without stopping. Second floor corridor, long and straight, and lit by the emergency fixtures. 3 doors on each side. At the far end, a figure, Serafina, back against the wall beside one of the doors, a thin line of blood along her left forearm that she was holding pressure on with her right hand. Dante was moving before he processed the decision. He reached her and looked at the arm. Long and shallow cut, not shot. She'd been cut by something. Her face was pale but controlled. 2 of them, she said. "One's in the room. The other went down the back stairs." He started. "I'm fine," she said, which probably 60% true. "The one in the room. He has Gerald's secondary files, physical documents. Batiste wanted them as confirmation of the financial data." "What's in them?" Rocco said. "Everything Gerald documented about the Vale succession clause," she said. "The original Enzo agreement. If Batiste gets those documents, he has legal leverage over the organization's structure that would take years to challenge in any forum that matters." Dante looked at the door. He looked at her arm. He looked at Rocco. "How many in the main hall?" he said to Rocco. 3 that I can confirm. Sauer himself I haven't located. Sauer unlocated was bad. Sauer was the most dangerous variable in the building, and nobody knew which room he was in. Dante tried the door handle. Locked from inside. He stepped back and looked at the frame old construction. The estate predated modern fire code door standards. The frame was solid wood, but the strike plate was original hardware from the 1960s. He hit it once, hard, his shoulder into the area beside the handle. The frame cracked, but held. He hit it again, and it gave, the door swinging in, hard, and he went through it, already moving to the right, away from the door's arc, because going through a door straight is how you get shot in the chest. The man inside was younger than Dante, expected mid-30s, dark jacket, one hand on a leather document case, and the other coming up with the same type of compressed air weapon. He fired, and the projectile hit the door frame behind Dante's head. Dante crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, and went for the weapon hand first. Not the man was secondary. The weapon was the immediate problem, and got his forearm under the wrist, and pushed it upward, and the second shot went into the ceiling. The document case hit the floor. Pages scattered. The man was trained. He abandoned the weapon rather than fight for it, switched immediately to close quarters, and for about 30 seconds the room was a contained and brutal thing. Furniture connecting with bodies and breath coming in, hard bursts, and the particular intimate violence of 2 people in a small space, each trying to put the other one down. Rocco came through the door, and it ended faster after that. The man was on the floor. Rocco had the weapon. Dante was standing with his hand against the wall catching his breath, a cut above his right eye from a corner of the desk that he hadn't managed to avoid, blood running into his eyebrow. He picked up the document case. He gathered the scattered pages, without reading them, put them back, snapped the case shut. Serafina came through the door, her right hand still holding pressure on her arm. She looked at the man on the floor and then at the case in Dante's hand. "The other one," she said. He went down the back stairs. "Toward the basement," Dante said. "Yes." From somewhere below them, muffled by the stone floors and the distance, came a sound. Not a shot. A shout. One word, indistinct, and then silence. All 3 of them looked at the floor. "Gerald," Rocco said. They moved for the stairs. The back stairwell was narrow and steep, and they went down it faster than was safe. Rocco first, Dante second with the case, Serafina behind him. The ground floor, the kitchen, the basement door. The basement door was open. They went through it and down and found the basement lit by a flashlight that someone had set upright on the schematic table like a lamp. Its beam hit the ceiling and scattered back down in a pale, disorienting wash. Gerald Oates was standing in the center of the room. His hands were at his sides. His face was the face of a man who has run his scenario through to completion and arrived at a place he hadn't fully imagined. Beside him, the man, from the second floor, the one who'd gone down the back stairs, had his weapon leveled. Between Gerald and the stairs, no cover. And then, from the far end of the basement, from the passage behind the wine rack, the east passage, one that Gerald had been planning to use to bring Sauer's people in, came the sound of movement. More than one person. Boots on stone. Sauer. Dante understood in the space of 2 seconds. Gerald had been the distraction. The man from the second floor was the blocker, and Sauer had been using the passage network that Gerald had provided. The passages, he'd believed, were the enemy's advantage to come in from behind them. They were standing in a box. Gerald looked at Serafina with an expression that contained something genuinely complex, not triumph, not satisfaction, but the look of a man who is ashamed of what he's done and is too committed to stop. "I'm sorry," he said. "I needed what they offered. I tried for 2 years to find another way." "You could have come to me," she said. "You would have told Dante." "No," she said quietly. "I wouldn't have." Gerald looked at her, and for a moment his composure cracked slightly, something underneath it that might have been the shape of the choice he'd made differently in another version of his life. And then the passage door opened, and Sauer came through it. He was a compact man in his 50s, gray at the temples, with the physical economy of someone who had spent decades making every movement count. He looked at the room with the assessing calm of a man who has planned for this geometry. He looked at Serafina. "The ledger," he said. "The physical financial ledger. Not in the basement." "No," she said. "Where is it?" She looked at him with an expression that Dante recognized, the expression she'd worn at the dinner table when he'd announced the divorce. The same absolute, unreadable stillness. "Somewhere you won't find it," she said. Sauer moved his gaze to Dante and then to the document case in Dante's hand. "That," he said, "I will take." He stepped forward, and one of his men came up beside him from the passage, and another from the stairs behind them, 2 angles, blocked, 6 feet of floor between the case and Sauer's outstretched hand. Dante felt Serafina's hand against his back. A single touch, low, brief, not a push. Signal. Something specific. He didn't know what it meant, and then he did, because she moved 1 step to the right at the same moment. And he understood she was clearing his left side, giving him an angle, and in the same instant Rocco moved. Not toward Sauer, toward the breaker panel on the east wall. The basement went black. In the absolute dark, Dante threw the document case hard toward where Sauer's voice had come from, and the sound of it, connecting with something, told him. His aim was close enough, and then he grabbed the edge of the schematic table and pulled it over, and the crash of it filled the basement, and he was already moving, by the sound of Serafina's breathing 3 feet to his left, finding the wall by touch, finding the wine rack, finding the passage panel. He got it open. He pushed her through first. He went through after. The panel closed behind them, and the passage was a total darkness that pressed against his eyes, and he reached forward and found her shoulder, and she was already moving. And he followed the contact of her shoulder blade through the dark, like a lifeline, his other hand on the stone wall, his breath ragged, and the cut above his eye, seeping warmth down his face. And behind them, the basement erupted back into sound, shouting. Sauer's commands. Specific fury of a man who has reached for something and found air. They ran. Rocco had been left behind. On the other side of the panel, in the dark of the basement, with Sauer and Gerald, and the men from the passage, and Dante knew it, and kept moving, because there was no world in which stopping helped Rocco. The only world that existed right now was the passage and the stone, and the sound of Serafina's breathing, and the gatehouse at the other end of it. Feet. 80. The passage angled upward. His dress shoes slipped on the incline, and he caught himself with his hand against the wall and kept going. Cut above his eye was dripping steadily. Now he could feel it on his cheekbone, taste it at the corner of his mouth. Serafina hit the panel at the top of the passage, the gatehouse panel, and it gave, and the gatehouse light was blinding after the dark of the tunnel, and they both came through it, gasping. The gatehouse was empty. The camera monitors were still running their looped feeds, which meant the outside world was still seeing what Sauer's team wanted them to see. Dante bent over with his hands on his knees and breathed. The document case was gone. He'd thrown it in the dark. It was on the basement floor. It was in Sauer's hands or scattered across the stone. Gone. Serafina was at the monitors, her injured arm, leaving a smear on the desk edge as she leaned in. Pulled something from her jacket pocket, a small device, thumb-sized, that she'd been carrying without him knowing. Connected it to the monitor console's input port. What is that? Dante said. The real camera feeds, she said. The 2021 units. I can push them live through the external relay from here. She typed something on the console. Feeds go to Gerald's monitoring account, the account that syncs to Batisti's network in New Orleans. Dante straightened, wiped the blood from his eye with the back of his hand, understood what she was doing. You're sending Batiste the real footage, he said. Everything that just happened. Everything that's happening right now. Everything Sauer's team has done inside this estate, she said. Timed and documented. She looked at him over her shoulder. Batiste is very careful about documentation, Dante. He doesn't authorize operations that leave his name attached to federal violations. He has a rule: if an operation generates evidence that can be traced back to the network, he cuts the team loose. Sauer, Dante said. The moment that footage lands in Batista's account, Sauer and his entire team become a liability that Batiste will immediately work to distance himself from. She turned back to the console. He won't send backup. He won't provide extraction. He'll deny the operation ever happened. A pause. Sauer knows this. Every contractor who works for Batiste knows this. It's why they're very careful about cameras. She hit one final key, and the monitor feeds flickered and switched to the 2021 footage, the real footage. Timestamp current, showing 4 different angles of the estate grounds and 2 interior spaces, all of them documenting the last hour of Sauer's operation in sharp, continuous detail. Done, she said. Dante looked at the monitors. He looked at his wife. Rocco, he said. Her face changed. Not dramatically, just a degree of tightening, a person holding the weight of something they haven't put down. Rocco can hold his own, she said. Her voice was steady and not quite as certain as she needed it to sound. We left him in there, Dante said. I know, with Sauer and 4 of his men. I know, she said again. And this time, the steadiness had an edge of fracture in it, the sound of someone maintaining control by will, rather than by conviction. From outside the gatehouse, from the direction of the main building, a sound. Not a shot, a door, and then footsteps on the gravel path, one person moving fast. Dante pressed himself beside the gatehouse door and waited. Footsteps reached the door and stopped. A knock, 2 sharp raps, then 1. Pattern. He looked at Serafina. She nodded. He opened the door. Rocco Marcelli stood on the path. His coat was gone. His face was marked on one side, a bruise already forming along his jaw, and he had one hand pressed against his ribs in a way that suggested the ribs were not happy. But he was standing. He was upright. His eyes were clear. Sauer's team is pulling back, Rocco said. His voice was strained but steady. All at once, like a switch was thrown. He looked at Serafina. What did you do? I told you I had a plan, she said. You told me several plans, Rocco said. I need to know which one we're actually. His phone buzzed. Dante's phone buzzed. Serafina's phone buzzed. All 3 of them looked at their screens simultaneously. The message came from 4 different captains, all using the estate's coded format, all arriving within 10 seconds of each other. Each one said the same thing in different words. Sauer's team withdrawing. Moving to north exit. No engagement. Request orders. Dante looked at his phone, and then at Serafina. She was reading something on her own screen. Her expression was the expression of someone receiving confirmation of something they've been waiting. But confirmation that's arrived alongside information they didn't anticipate. She looked up. Battisti cut Sauer loose, she said. He's done. His team knows it. They're not dying for an operation their network has already disowned. She lowered the phone. But Battisti sent something else. She held the screen toward Dante. He read it. A message forwarded through Gerald's network account, forwarded automatically by the same relay she just used to send the footage, which meant the relay worked in both directions, which meant everything Gerald had received was now visible to them. The message was from a number attributed to V. Battisti, New Orleans. It read, Clean house. Leave no evidence of the operation. That includes the architect. The architect. Dante looked up from the screen. Gerald, he said. Batiste just ordered Sauer to kill Gerald before they pull out, Serafina said, to eliminate the connection between them. The 3 of them stood in the gatehouse doorway, and the estate grounds were quiet in the way that things are quiet between one kind of terrible thing ending and another beginning. And somewhere in the main building, Gerald Oates, 22 years, the funeral, the federal investigation, coffee table conversations, and the careful handwriting in the margin of documents, was alone with a team that had just been told to leave him behind in a very specific way. And the clock on that was already running. Dante Veyron looked at his wife. Where in the building, he said. She was already moving. They moved across the estate grounds at a run. All 3 of them. Rocco favoring his left side where the ribs were damaged, but keeping pace through the discipline of someone who has learned to separate pain from function. The main building's side entrance was still propped. They went through it and into the kitchen corridor and stopped. The estate had gone quiet in the specific way of a tactical withdrawal. Not the quiet of resolution, but the quiet of people moving carefully, purposefully, toward an exit. Sauer's team was pulling out. The question was the order in which they were doing it, and whether Gerald was still breathing while they did. Serafina held up one hand and they stopped moving. She listened. From the direction of the east corridor, low voices. One of them strained, the other clipped and directive. 2 people. The strained voice was Gerald. Dante recognized it by the specific quality of his careful diction. The same voice that had sat across tables from him for 22 years, explaining financial exposure and pathway options, now compressed into something smaller by fear. Move, Serafina said quietly. They went down the east corridor. Dante was first around the corner, and he saw them, one of Sauer's men with Gerald by the collar, moving him toward the exterior door at the end of the corridor. The man's weapon was at his side. Not raised, he was using one hand for Gerald and keeping the other for the door, which meant he hadn't heard them come around the corner. Dante covered the distance in 6 steps, and the man heard him on the 4th and started to turn, and didn't finish the turn because Dante's forearm connected with his throat and drove him back into the wall, and the weapon clattered on the floor, and Rocco had it before it stopped moving. Gerald stumbled sideways and caught himself against the wall with both hands, breathing in raw, audible pulls. The man Dante had hit was on the floor, hands at his throat, the specific helpless focus of someone whose airway has been compressed and who is currently occupied entirely with the project of breathing. Dante stepped back. His hands were shaking slightly, the adrenaline finding its way out through his fingers. He pressed them flat against his thighs and looked at Gerald. Gerald looked back at him. His hair was disordered, his collar torn where he'd been dragged. His eyes held the look of a man who has been running a version of events in his head for months. The version where none of this happened, where he found some other way through whatever corner he'd been backed into, and has finally arrived at the end of that version, and has nothing left to hide behind. "I need you to tell me something," Dante said. His voice was steadier than he expected. Gerald waited. "All of it," Dante said. "Not the parts you think I need. All of it, right now." Gerald looked past him at Serafina. Something passed across his face, not a request for rescue, not quite. More the look of a man checking to see who's in the room before he decides what is true. "She can hear it," Dante said. "Say it to both of us." Gerald straightened. He smoothed the front of his jacket by reflex, a habitual gesture, the motion of a man reassembling his dignity in the wreckage of everything else. Then he said, "Marcus came to me in November of 2024. He had documentation of a financial position I'd taken in 2021 a hedge through an intermediary account that I hadn't disclosed to you. It wasn't illegal in itself, but in context it looked like skimming. It wasn't skimming." His voice was precise and tired, but it looked like it. "And Marcus knew that if he brought it to you, the conversation would be over before I could explain. He offered me an alternative. Information, periodically. Low exposure. He told me the Batiste network had no interest in destabilizing the Veyron operation. They only wanted financial intelligence to position their own investments." "And you believed that," Dante said. "I believed it for about 3 months," Gerald said. "After that, I knew it wasn't true, and I was in too deep to get out." He looked at his hands. "I told myself it was containable. I told myself every month that the next transmission would be the last." He stopped. Then, quietly, "I know what that sounds like." "It sounds like what it is," Rocco said from behind Dante, not unkindly. "Yes," Gerald said. "It does." Dante looked at the man on the floor, who was recovering, sitting up now, and at Rocco, who still had the weapon trained at a precise and professional angle. He looked at Gerald, who had worked for his family since before Dante was old enough to understand what that meant, and he felt something complex and unresolvable move through him and settle somewhere deep without resolving. "Where is Marcus now?" he said. "He left before Sauer's team moved in," Gerald said. "He was never going to be on the estate when it happened. He was running communication relay from the parking structure on the north side." A pause. "He'll be listening for confirmation that it's done. When it doesn't come, he'll know something went wrong. He'll run." "How fast?" Serafina said. It was the first thing she'd said since they'd come around the corner, and her voice had a quality to it, not anger. Something colder than anger, the functional temperature of someone converting feeling into purpose. "He has a route prepared," Gerald said. "He always has a route prepared. Canada, probably. He has assets there." He looked at her directly. "I know which assets. I helped him set them up in 2022 because he told me they were family emergency accounts." Serafina pulled her phone. "Don't call the police," Dante said. She looked at him. "Not yet," he said. "I want Marcus first." "Dante, give me an hour," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she made a different call, not the police. Judge Harriet Calloway, who answered on the second ring, who listened without speaking, who said 3 words at the end, "I'll make calls." She hung up. Dante looked at her. "Border notification," she said simply. "Harriet has contacts in Federal Transit. Marcus Webb's existing documentation gets flagged in the next 20 minutes. He can run to the parking structure. He can run to the airport. He can drive north all night. He's not crossing any border with his real name or his prepared identity. She pocketed the phone. I've known about the Canadian assets since March. I let them sit because I needed Marcus operational until tonight. Corridor was quiet. Outside, somewhere on the estate grounds, the last of Sauer's team was moving through the dark toward the north perimeter, pulling back from an operation their network had already disowned. Inside, the building held the aftermath of the last few hours in its temperature and its smell cold stone and disturbed dust and the particular spent quality of spaces where violent things have happened. Rocco said, "The man on the floor." They all looked at him. He was sitting against the wall, his hand at his throat, watching them with the cautious assessment of someone calculating odds. Rocco said to him, "You walk out the north gate. You don't come back. You tell Sauer the estate is clean." He paused. "You tell him nothing else." The man looked at Rocco, then at Dante, then at Serafina, who was looking at him with an expression so neutral it was its own kind of threat. He nodded. Rocco stepped back and let him stand. The man straightened, recovered the basic posture of someone who intends to appear controlled, and walked to the exterior door and through it without looking back. Gerald watched him go. "What happens to me?" Gerald said. Not a plea. A genuine question. The question of a man who has run the possibilities and understands that he is not the one with the answer. Dante looked at Serafina. She looked at Gerald for a long moment. Whatever was happening in that look had 22 years in it. 22 years of morning meetings and financial reports, and the specific trust of handing someone the mechanisms of everything you've built and believing they'll maintain them faithfully. The weight of that was visible in her face, not as tears, nothing so simple as that, but as a particular exhaustion that sat behind her eyes and didn't shift. "You're going to write it down," she said. "Everything. Marcus, the transmissions, the Batiste account details, the Canadian assets, everything you gave them, and when. You're going to write it clearly enough that someone who wasn't in the room can understand it completely." She held his gaze. "And then you're going to deliver it to Judge Calloway's office by 8 tomorrow morning." "And after that," Gerald said. "After that you retire," she said. Quietly. "You move somewhere, and you live a small life, and you don't come back into this one." She looked away from him, which was its own kind of dismissal. "I'm not going to destroy what's left of you, Gerald. You did enough of that yourself." Gerald pressed his lips together. His eyes were wet, which he didn't appear to notice. He nodded once, and the nod had in it the specific quality of a man accepting in the terms that he knows he doesn't deserve, which is the hardest kind of mercy to receive. He walked to the exterior door. He stopped with his hand on it. Without turning around, he said, "The hedge account. In 2021, I was saving for daughter's medical costs. She was sick for 2 years." He paused. "I should have come to you." "Yes," Serafina said. "You should have." He went out. Corridor was empty. The three of them stood in it, and the estate was quiet around them, in the way that things are quiet when the emergency is past, and the damage is waiting to be counted. Rocco let out a breath that he'd apparently been holding for some time. He pressed his free hand against his jaw tightened briefly, and then relaxed. "I need to sit down," he said, not as a complaint, just as information. "There's a chair in the kitchen," Serafina said, "and a first aid kit under the sink." He nodded and moved past them toward the kitchen, and his footsteps in the corridor were careful and deliberate, the footsteps of a man conserving what he has left. Dante watched him go and felt something for Rocco Marcelli that he didn't have an adequate word for. Not quite forgiveness, not quite gratitude, something that contained both, and also the particular complicated respect of a man who has learned, very recently, to see other people more clearly than he used to. He turned to Serafina. She was looking at her arm. Cut had stopped bleeding actively, the pressure of her hand having done its work, but the sleeve was dark with it, and her face in the corridor light was pale in a way that had progressed from earlier. "That needs to be cleaned," he said. "I know. Let me." She looked at him. The look held for a beat not resistance, not the careful management of distance she'd maintained for years, but something uncertain, something that didn't know yet how to read an offer from him that wasn't freighted with the old dynamics. "All right," she said. They went to the kitchen. Rocco was in the chair near the counter. his jacket apart, working through the first aid kit with the focused attention of a man who has patched himself up before and knows the process. He looked up when they came in, but didn't say anything, which was the right choice. Dante found the secondary kit in the cabinet above the refrigerator, the one he'd never known was there until Serafina had mentioned it in passing earlier that night, and brought it to the kitchen table. She sat across from him and extended her arm, and he cleaned the cut with the antiseptic from the kit and felt her draw a short, controlled breath at the sting of it and hold it. He didn't tell her it wasn't that bad, because it would have been condescending, and she knew what it was. He just worked carefully, the way you work when the thing you're doing is the only thing available to you. When he'd taped it closed, she flexed her fingers twice experimentally, and then looked at the cut and then at him. "Your eye," she said. "It's fine, it's bleeding." He touched the cut above his eye with the back of his hand, found it still seeping. She took the kit and a piece of gauze and reached across the table and pressed it to the cut without asking. And he went still under her hand the way you go still when something you've been bracing against doesn't arrive. They sat like that for a moment in the kitchen of the estate at 10:30 at night, with the aftermath of everything settling around them like dust after a collapse. "Marcus," he said, because something in him needed to say it, needed to put the name in the room. "He'll be in a holding situation by morning," she said. She maintained the pressure on his eye with clinical steadiness. "Harriet's people are good. He won't know the net is there until he tries to move through it. And Baptiste. Baptiste is in New Orleans watching footage of his own operation, documented in detail, and trying to figure out how to be innocent of it," she said. "He'll spend the next 6 months doing that. Sauer's team is blown. They'll surface eventually, and when they do, the footage will be waiting." She lowered the gauze and examined the cut. "It's already sent to 3 different destinations. One of them is a federal inbox." "You had federal contacts," Dante said. "All this time." "Enzo had federal contacts," she said. "He passed them to me. In the same conversation, he gave me the succession document. He believed very strongly in what he called structural insurance." A faint, dry quality in her voice that was as close as she came to dark humor. He would have liked tonight, in a strange way. He liked it when the structure proved itself, Rocco said from his chair, without looking up from the rib tape he was applying. The old man would have hated tonight. He would have liked tomorrow, when everything's still standing. "That's more accurate," Serafina said. The kitchen was warm, and the overhead light was ordinary and domestic, and the contrast with the last several hours was disorienting in the way that ordinary things become strange after prolonged emergency. Dante looked at the table, at the kit, at his own hands with the dried blood in the creases of his knuckles, and he thought about the dining room and the dinner that had started all of it, which felt now like something that happened to different people, or the same people in a country they'd since left. "The elders," he said. "The family. What happens at the table now?" Serafina was quiet for a moment. She folded the used gauze carefully, a small, precise motion. "The table changes," she said. "The succession document becomes the operating structure, formally, with the surviving captains and the elders as witnesses. It was always the operating structure. This just makes it legible." She set the folded gauze down. "Captains who are compromised are out. The financial architecture gets rebuilt with outside audit. Someone, Gerald didn't train, and Marcus didn't know. The routes that Celeste transmitted get rerouted." She paused. "Takes about a year, maybe 18 months. It's not simple." "And Celeste," he said. "Celeste Arden spent 4 months inside, a criminal organization conducting intelligence operations for a competing network," Serafina said. "The same federal inbox that received the Batiste footage has a file on her. She'll have a conversation with people who are very interested in the details of how the Batiste network recruits and positions assets." A pause. "Intelligent, and she's practical. She'll cooperate. She'll get a deal that reflects that." Dante looked at her. "You arranged all of it." "I arranged the container," she said. "People inside it made their own choices." He sat back in the kitchen chair. He looked at the ceiling old plaster, the faint water stain near the light fixture that he'd been meaning to have someone look at for 3 years. The ordinary evidence of a life maintained, a house lived in, the accumulation of deferred attention that constitutes the background of every real place. "The succession document," he said. "The clause, the authority. Yes, she said. You hold it. Yes. He looked back down from the ceiling. He looked at her face, which was tired in a way that was finally visible, the 11 years of it, the 8 years of maintenance and patience, and the careful management of everything he hadn't been paying attention to. All of it settling into the planes of her face in the kitchen light. I have a question, he said. She waited. If I hadn't announced the divorce, he said. If I'd made a different choice at the dinner table, stayed, told Celeste it wasn't going to happen, told the elders the marriage was intact. He watched her face. What then? She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, the Batiste operation still would have happened. Marcus and Gerald were already in motion that wasn't contingent on your announcement. She folded her hands on the table. But the Batiste operation would have found a different target, an organization where the leadership was unified. Harder to compromise. They might have failed. They likely would have failed, she said. Yes, he absorbed that in us. She looked at him steadily. We might have been different, she said. Or we might have gotten here anyway by a different route. I don't know. She looked at her hands. I knew you were building towards something with Celeste for months before the dinner. I knew the moment you started pulling back from rooms you used to want to be in. I just didn't know if you'd pull back all the way. Her voice was even and unhurried. Part of me kept expecting you to recalibrate. I didn't. No, she said, you didn't. They sat. They sat in the quiet of the kitchen, and Rocco finished with the rib back on and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man deciding that whatever is happening in this room is not his business, which was the correct assessment. Then Dante said, I want to ask you something else. She looked at him. Stay, he said. Not in the way he'd said things to her for 11 years. Not with the implicit weight of assumption, the expectation of a man who has mistaken permanence for ownership. He said it plainly, with his hands on the table and the blood still in the creases of his knuckles and his eye taped shut on one side. And there was no performance in it, no calculation, just the word. Serafina looked at him for a long time. Long enough that Rocco found something very interesting to examine on the far wall. I'm not leaving, she said. This is my house, I know, Dante said. I mean, stay in the way you've been. Don't shut me out of the parts I didn't know about. He held her gaze. Let me know the actual situation. You'll have to be able to hear it, she said. I know. It won't always be comfortable. I know that too. She was quiet for a moment. Then we'll see. Which was not yes. But it was not the version of no that ends things. It was the version of not yet. That means something is still being decided. Which was more honest than any. Yes, she could have given him at a kitchen table at 11 at night with the blood barely dried. Accepted it. The next 3 weeks were not simple. Nothing that followed was simple, which was perhaps the most important truth of everything that had happened, because simple would have been false. And the thing that the Veyron estate had never been able to sustain was falseness. Marcus Webb was detained at a regional airport, 2 hours north of the city, at 4 in the morning, attempting to board a private charter under a name that had been flagged by Harriet Calloway's contacts 40 minutes after Serafina had made the call. He had a bag with 3 passports and enough cash to disappear for 2 years. He looked at the agents who met him at the gate with the expression of a man who has known this moment, was coming for a long time, and is surprised to find himself still surprised by it. Cooperated. He had, Dante learned later, very little choice, because Gerald's written account delivered to Judge Calloway's office at 7:45 in the morning, 12 pages in Gerald's precise, careful handwriting had arrived before Marcus finished his first cup of coffee in the detention facility. The documentation was thorough. It was damning in the specific, legible way of something written by a man who has spent 22 years being professionally precise and has decided, at the end, to be precise one last time about the thing that matters most. Celeste Arden met with federal investigators for 11 hours across 3 sessions. She was, as Serafina had predicted, intelligent and practical. She gave them the Batiste Network's recruitment structure, the asset positioning methodology, the financial channels, and 3 other operations currently in progress in cities that were not Chicago. She negotiated well. She got a reasonable outcome under the circumstances, which she would never fully acknowledge, but which she privately understood was more than she'd earned. Vincent Batiste in New Orleans spent 4 months talking to lawyers and not sleeping well and watching the documentation of his operation play out in a federal process he had no mechanism to stop. He was careful, and he was wealthy, and he was not ultimately charged with anything that put him in a room with a judge. But the Batiste Network's Chicago ambitions were over. Its key operatives were exposed or flipped or fled, and the cost of the failed operation was considerable enough that Batiste would not recover his position in the regional hierarchy for years, if ever. Serafina had not needed to destroy him. She had simply needed to make him expensive, and she had done that with the footage and the documentation and the cold, structural patience of someone who understands that the most lasting damage is rarely the dramatic kind. The Veyron organization restructured. It took 14 months, which was within Serafina's estimate, and the process was not clean or easy. 3 captains out. The financial architecture rebuilt from the foundation. 2 new accountants, both vetted through channels that Dante now understood and participated in. The routes rerouted. The elder council reconvened under the succession structure, which they formalized with the kind of low ceremony that old institutions prefer, a signed document and a room full of people who understood what they were signing and why. At that meeting, Serafina sat at the head of the table. Dante sat to her right, not at the other end of the table in the position he'd occupied for 16 years. To her right, in the position that historically signified counsel, the position of the person whose opinion the head of the table values and considers. He had sat there without ceremony, without acknowledgement of the change, as if it was the most natural reconfiguration in the world, because by that point, for him it was. He was not the same man who had put his palm flat on the dining room table and said the words that started everything. He was not better in any simple sense. He was not suddenly without appetite or arrogance or the particular hardness that Marco Veyron had passed to him like a gene. But he was different in the specific way of someone who has been broken down to the actual structure of themselves and has discovered that the structure can hold, that there is something underneath the performance of authority that is worth building on, even if building on it requires starting almost completely over. He was learning to ask questions before stating conclusions. It was harder than it sounds. Rocco's ribs healed. He was back in full operation within 3 weeks, which was about a week sooner than medically advisable, which was the most predictable thing about him. He resumed his position as underboss under the restructured council, which was now a position defined by the succession document rather than by Dante's personal authority, and he operated within that definition with the same steadiness he'd always brought to whatever structure he was working inside. The difference was that the structure was now honest, said what it was. Rocco found this privately a significant improvement. Celeste Arden went to a city that was not Chicago and began a different kind of life, which she made work through the same intelligence and practical determination she'd applied to everything else. She never thought about Dante Veyron as anything except a professional miscalculation. She thought about Serafina sometimes with the specific respect of someone who has been outplayed by a better player, which is the purest form of respect available in the world she inhabited. Gerald Oates moved to a small house on the eastern shore of a lake that was 3 states away from Chicago, called his daughter every Sunday. He did not call anyone connected to the Veyron organization or to anyone he'd known in his previous life. He read a lot. He cooked badly and improved gradually, and that improvement, the slow, patient work of getting better at something, through repetition and attention felt, in its small way, like a kind of penance that was also a kind of living. The estate quieted over time. Not emptied, it was a working property, and it remained one, but the specific tension of a place where secrets have been long maintained and longer concealed gradually released itself. The way old wood releases moisture over time, changing its shape slightly, settling into something truer to itself. One evening in late autumn, 8 months after the night that changed everything, Dante came into the east sitting room and found Serafina there as he had found her on the morning after the dinner in the chair near the window with a book. The difference was that this time he in, without urgency, without an accusation forming, without the defensive alertness of a man who had something to prove about his own authority. He sat down in the other chair, the one across from hers. He didn't have a book. He looked out the window at the estate grounds, going rust and gold in the autumn light, and then he looked at her. She looked up. They looked at each other across the room, and the 11 years, and the months since. Fireplace was going. The room smelled of it. "The Devarro meeting," she said. "Tomorrow. I want you to lead it." He looked at her. "You're sure?" "You know the Devarro situation better than I do," she said. "I know the background. You know the men." She looked back at her book. "Lead it. I'll be there." He nodded. She read. He looked at the fire. Outside, the estate grounds were going dark, in the particular way of autumn evenings, the light failing slowly and the shadows of the old trees stretching long across the grass. And the iron gate at the end of the long driveway stood the way it had stood since 1974, because some things are built to last, and the question is never whether they can hold, but whether the people inside them deserve the holding. Dante Veyron, who had believed for 44 years that deserving was something you declared rather than demonstrated, was learning slowly, imperfectly, with the specific difficulty of someone relearning a language they'd never actually been fluent up in. That demonstration takes longer and costs more, and is the only kind that means anything. He didn't know yet whether the distance between who he'd been and who he was becoming was crossable, but he was still there. He had stayed. And in the east sitting room of the Veyron estate, with the fire going, and the autumn pressing gently against the windows, and the woman who had built something around him that he'd never had the eyes to see, now turning a page in the light, that felt not like enough, not yet, possibly not ever fully, but like the beginning of something that was at least worth the trying. Fire burned low. Neither of them moved to add wood. The room held them in its warmth a little longer, and outside the estate breathed in the dark, and the gate stood, and the night came on.